thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Ins and Outs of PBMs, hosted by Centris Specialty. As a note, this session is being recorded, and a link to the playback will be distributed in a few days after the presentation. Questions for the speaker can be submitted in the comments section of your WebEx screen, and we will try to address as many of those questions as possible. My name is Steve Zabriskie, Senior Director of Payer Strategies for Centris Specialty. For those not familiar with our organization, we are a service offering of Apexis LLC. Centris Specialty is not a pharmacy. It is an innovative solution designed to enable health systems, including academic medical centers, integrated delivery networks, and community-based organizations to establish and grow their own specialty pharmacy based in their health systems. We do this by fostering collaboration and problem solving among our 66 health system clients who are spread across the country. As an organization, we work toward getting access to limited distribution drugs and restricted payer networks for our clients and remain abreast of other industry challenges that may arise. Centris Specialty also provides certain data support services required for success in specialty pharmacy. And now I am pleased to introduce our featured speaker, Jesse Dresser. Jesse is an attorney and partner in the pharmacy law group at the law firm of Frier Levitt. Jesse is a graduate of Seton Hall University of Law, where he received his Juris Doctor, magna cum laude. He also attended the University of Connecticut, where he also graduated magna cum laude. Jesse has bar admission in the state of New Jersey, and we're pleased to have him present here today. Jesse?
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to Centris to sponsoring this webinar and putting it together. We have a lot to cover in about an hour, so I'm going to go into it pretty quickly and skip some of the introduction. Just quick background about the firm. We are a healthcare boutique life sciences firm focusing on representing the healthcare industry and providers and ancillary companies of all types. My experience has been with the firm now since 2010, and my area of practice primarily has been in representing pharmacies and different types of pharmacy providers within the drug distribution channel. So the topic for today's discussion is the ins and outs of PBMs, and the focus of the discussion is to talk about the different types of plans that are out there, the different rules that apply to those different types of plans, and some rights and tools that pharmacy providers, especially health system and hospital pharmacies, have at their disposal to even the scale, so to speak, when it comes to dealing with the different types of plans and pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. So this slide is a good introduction because it shows the breakdown of the different types of healthcare coverage within the country. We have the largest segment, the green segment, is employer group market. These are instances where there is a large employer, there are small employers, there are public employees. We even have a small little segment for military through the TRICARE program of folks receiving their health care coverage through their employer, essentially. The orange segment down at the bottom is Medicare. That represents the next largest segment of overall coverage, and it blends and overlaps to some degree with Medicaid, which we see in red, which also overlaps a little bit with the ACA expansion, and finally there's the individual market and uninsured. So this is a good picture to show where virtually all Americans sit within the healthcare continuum in terms of what type of coverage they have. And this is important because each different segment on this chart is governed by a different set of laws and has different rights and responsibilities available to providers. So I always like to start with a quick overview of the pharmacy benefit landscape. So we start with the concept of plan sponsors. These could be employers, unions, government programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, etc. They, in turn, contract with health insurance companies, either on an administrative services only basis, where essentially the health insurance company is merely providing coverage, adjudicating and processing claims, or through a group health insurance program, where essentially the plan sponsor is paying premiums on behalf of its beneficiaries. In turn, either the health insurance company or the plan sponsor directly contract with a PBM to administer the pharmacy benefits. The PBM in turn contracts with a network of retail and specialty pharmacies, in addition to most often owning and operating their own mail order and specialty pharmacies. Thereafter, the PBM negotiates with manufacturers for rebates and formulary placement, and the manufacturers in turn sell products to pharmacies through wholesalers. Now, these independent pharmacies and the PBM-owned pharmacies both compete with one another to service the patients, who at the end of the day are employees of the plan sponsor, who either self-funds their claims or covers health insurance premiums on their behalf, or they are beneficiaries of the government program. So one of the goals of today's discussion is to talk about the different types of plans that are out there and some of the rules that apply to those plans. So if we think back to that first slide, we can kind of break down the commercial business into two basic categories. So fully insured plans and self-funded plans. Fully insured plans would include types of coverage like PPOs, employer-paid premiums, HMOs, group health policy, individual health policies, etc. Self-funded plans, on the other hand, are instances where there is a large employer like Exxon or Pepsi, or there's a union group that rather than pay premiums because they have so many employees, they will just come up with a budget of the total amount of expected claims that they anticipate paying out on their beneficiaries' behalf and self-fund those claims. Why pay a 15% premium over the charges when you could just simply pay the charges if you have enough cash to do it? So in turn, they typically contract with health insurance companies. On the fully insured side, they're contracting through a risk-bearing arrangement. It's the fully insured plans are paying premium, and the insurance company bears actuarial risk on those plans. On the other hand, for the self-funded plans, they're merely paying an administrative fee for the health insurance company to build the network and process claims. And so, as I mentioned, the insurance company is bearing risk when it manages those fully insured plans, but it has no risk at all when it's administering the administrative services only plans. So when they contract with the PBMs, health insurance companies have oftentimes been demonstrated to provide better terms on a lot of issues, including pricing, rebates, and other things on their risk-bearing lines of business, and in exchange sometimes purposely include worse or sub-market terms to compensate for the better-than-market terms that they're getting on the risk side of this. This was the subject of a large litigation involving Anthem and Express Scripts, where Anthem was essentially forking up its self-funded lines of business as fodder in exchange for getting better terms on the lines of business where it bore actuarial risk. And so these concepts are important as we start to understand and unravel the nuances of the different plans, particularly those that fit into this right category, these self-funded plans. And as integrated health system and hospital pharmacies and broader health systems, you are positioned in a very unique area to be able to provide unique services to these self-funded plans that move away from the traditional model of contracting with a PBM. So we've talked a little bit about this concept of ERISA. ERISA is an acronym for the Employee Retirement Security Act. That is a federal law passed in 1974, setting forth the standards for administering employee health benefits, including the processing of health claims under the plan. Now, this extends beyond just health benefits. It would include pensions and other forms of employee benefits. Among the things that's required by ERISA is that every plan include a summary plan description, unless there's some exception that applies. The summary plan description, sometimes referred to as an SPD, is required to sufficiently and accurately apprise the participants and beneficiaries of their rights and obligations under the plan. And this is a very, very important document because this is what's going to set forth the appeal rights for those beneficiaries. It's going to set forth what they can expect their networks to look like. It's going to set forth what they can expect their copay to look like, and there's a whole process that needs to be followed. And that's why I want to educate you all about this concept of the SPD, because when you find yourself facing network access issues where you want to service a particular patient, but you're being told that it has to go to the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy, there may be rights and tools and strategies buried within this summary plan document, and being large employers at the same time as providers, you're positioned in a very unique spot to be able to make use of these terms and be able to exploit some of these rights and tools. Now, at the same time, we've also talked a little bit about how there are other laws that might apply to health insurance plans. Some of these laws might be any willing provider laws, they might be fair audit laws, they might be prompt pay laws that are drafted at the state level. And there's this concept of preemption where in some instances the federal law, the federal or ERISA law, will supersede or preempt state laws to the contrary. So because ERISA is a federal statute, it preempts state laws that touch on the same issue. However, under ERISA, the states were still given the right to regulate the business of insurance. So what that means, if we look at our pie chart, ERISA will essentially preempt any law that relates to an employee benefit, which will touch on not only virtually all of the self-funded plans, because as we go back to the earlier slide, there is no insurance, there's no actuarial issue going on, as well as some aspects of group insurance where it's an employer-paid premium scenario because it's an employee benefit. So it's an important concept to be mindful of as we start to test the parameters of some of these state laws and tools that are available to pharmacy providers, and bearing in mind that there is always a concern that some of these might face a challenge as being preempted by ERISA. The other concept I want to talk quickly about ERISA is this concept of fiduciary responsibility, because I know that this is a concept that again, being an integrated health system and hospital pharmacy organization, presents unique opportunities. So, an ERISA fiduciary is a person or entity who is required to act for the benefit of the plan participants and cannot engage in prohibited transactions. So, for example, a fiduciary cannot allow the plan to enter into a transaction with a party in interest or engage in self-dealing transaction with the plan. Now, this comes up because, again, these unique situations that are presented by your organizations where you employ pharmacists, and your pharmacists are boots on the ground, and you understand the issues related to pharmacoeconomics and efficacy of different types of products. And your views might differ than the PBM's views or the health insurance broker's views on what is the most effective drug, most cost-effective too. Your views might choose to place other drugs on a formulary for other reasons, while the PBM might have a large rebate from the manufacturer and in turn want to put a different drug on the formulary. The point here is there is the ability to have some level of involvement in this discussion process. However, it's important that pharmacies and health systems be mindful of the prohibitions on self-dealing or entering into interested transactions, and instead provide the advice only in the context of what is best for the plan as opposed to necessarily what is best for the bottom line of the hospital health system pharmacy itself as a dispensing entity. So with that backdrop, I'd like to talk a little bit about this concept of specialty pharmacy. This has become one of the fastest growth areas, not only within pharmacy, but within healthcare as a whole, and has converted many hospital and health system pharmacies from what might have been cost centers 5-6 years ago to now profit centers because of the increased prevalence of specialty medication, the increased prescribing of specialty medication, and the high costs associated with specialty medication. So, in terms of what is specialty, payers, including PBMs, have all different kinds of definitions of specialty pharmacy. Some have much more detailed definitions that touch on being designed to deliver medications with special handling, storage, or distribution requirements, or have to focus on clinical economic outcomes for patients and oftentimes tied to complex or chronic or rare conditions. Other PBMs define it simply as submitting more than 25% of your claims as specialty in a given month. And others still will look at the total combined average wholesale price of your drug product in any given month, and if more than 50% of it is specialty, you're a specialty pharmacy. Other payers still have no definition whatsoever, and some use the concept of specialty drug lists and don't necessarily categorize a provider as a specialty pharmacy, but rather look more at the drugs that are being dispensed and treat perhaps those drugs differently if they fall into certain categories. So in contracting with specialty pharmacies, payers have used a variety of networks that have applied. Some of these are closed or exclusive specialty pharmacy networks. These are instances where a payer simply says either we don't have a specialty pharmacy network, and lo and behold, the only pharmacy you can get your specialty medication from is the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy, or they might say we have one, but it's closed. We're not accepting new applications. We're not allowing new pharmacies into that network. We've typically seen that more in the context of self-funded ERISA plans, again, because there isn't a lot of these state laws or Medicare rules that would protect pharmacies, that would drive PBMs to want to admit other pharmacies. Because again, if it's a profit center for the health system pharmacy, you can very well assume that it's a profit center for the PBM as well. The other type of specialty pharmacy network we've seen is an open specialty pharmacy network, but with very heightened admission criteria. We're starting to see this a little bit more, particularly in some commercial networks in states where there are strong any willing provider components. And then finally, there's the concept of open specialty networks. We see this the most in the Medicare Part D context. Even this is starting to yield in favor of kind of the middle bullet point, where they are imposing higher and higher admission requirements. So in terms of trends in specialty pharmacy network design, as I mentioned, historically they've used these closed networks where they would try to route as many prescriptions as possible to their wholly owned specialty pharmacies. Over time, they began letting pharmacies into Medicare Part D specialty pharmacy networks only, but again, maintaining that there weren't networks for commercial, or that the networks for commercial were closed. After a series of rebukes by CMS, as I mentioned, the any willing provider laws of Medicare Part D prevailed and resulted in PBMs, again, beginning to allow pharmacies into these networks. Certain PBMs began identifying pharmacies, primarily as specialty pharmacies, based on volume of claims submission, and in turn saying, okay, you're a specialty pharmacy, we're going to contract with you as a specialty pharmacy, but lo and behold, you're going to get a reimbursement rate that's much lower. And then, as I mentioned, others have begun to create open specialty networks, but with these higher admission criteria or barriers to entry. So with respect to some of these network reimbursement addendums, these are the situations where they've identified the pharmacies primarily as specialty pharmacies and claim that they're no longer eligible for standard retail pharmacy network reimbursement rates. They use the PBM specialty drug list to identify these pharmacies, and they provide these network amendments and reimbursement addenda on a take it or leave it basis, meaning either you accept these new terms or you're not going to be in the network any longer. The reimbursement rates we've seen are 3 to 5% lower than retail rates, oftentimes with little to no dispensing fee. So some of these PBMs have also begun to utilize new specialty provider credentialing processes. These are situations where many are seeking high application or processing fees, some as high as $3,500 just to apply to the network. Many times there is an on-site inspection requirement so that the PBM is going to come out and conduct an on-site inspection of the operations, and this is something that's critical for a number of reasons, because you're going to very much need to be prepared, because these on-site inspections are very thorough. They look at a variety of things, and it's important to not only have your policies and procedures in place, but to have solid training of the staff to make sure that when they come on site, you're ready to go, you're following all those items. Finally, some PBMs will give a buffer of time in order to obtain required accreditation, but many times they require proof of having begun the process to be able to show that you're in process and that you're already under application. So in terms of some of these credentialing requirements, the most significant and most common, I'd say, is a requirement that the pharmacy be accredited in at least one of the following, either ACHC, URAC, or Joint Commission. URAC and ACHC seem to be the most common. Some have even begun to require dual accreditation, which can be problematic in some instances because in some instances the accreditations require different things, and so it can be very, very difficult for a pharmacy to be able to segment out how to comply with both requirements that are applicable to, say, URAC, as well as requirements that are applicable to ACHC. There's also terms that generally require higher insurance coverage as opposed to a regular retail pharmacy, whereas you might need only $1 million per occurrence, $3 million in the aggregate for a retail pharmacy. If you want to be a specialty pharmacy, you might require $5 million per occurrence, $10 million in the aggregate, which obviously increases costs of premiums. They also want to see detailed policies and procedures, and importantly, many instances want to see disease-specific policies and procedures and clinical protocols. They'll also want to see shipping and tracking controls in addition to mechanical and system tools. Some of them have even required the use of high-tech equipment and materials, including bottle hoppers, counting machines, conveyor belt systems, all geared to show that the pharmacy can support a larger volume of claims without having an impact on overall clinical performance. Some of the other terms we've seen crop up is proof of being able to access limited distribution drugs. This, as I'll get into momentarily, can be a bit of a chicken or the egg issue, where in order to get access to limited distribution drugs, you need to show the manufacturer that you have payer contracts, and in order to get the payer contracts, you need to show that you have access to limited distribution drugs. It becomes a very tricky ordeal to muddle through, but one that we think that there might be some strategies to employ. In addition, they want to see detailed reporting requirements and capabilities. These are ongoing, typically, where not only do you have to provide data at the time of contracting, but on a regular basis. And if your reporting falls behind in any way, it can cause grounds for termination. They also want to see procedures relating to FDA recall, ability to monitor patient utilization and in-home inventories. 50-state licensure is also typically a component that is found in a lot of these specialty applications, particularly if you want to do any form of mailing, even in-state mailing. They also want to see access to nursing services and data on call answering speed. A lot of this is subsumed within the policies and procedures for your accreditations, but in any event, it's information that has to be demonstrated to the PBMs as part of the credentialing process, and so it's important that not only are you following those protocols that you have in place from your accreditation, but you're able to pivot on those and provide that information when it's necessary to support an application or to remain in network. So, transitioning from there, there's the concept of what are the pros and cons of a specialty contract. As I mentioned, when you come into being a true specialty pharmacy and you start being pushed into either given the opportunity to apply for a specialty contract or actually being pushed into one, there are different rights and privileges and as well as responsibilities and detriments. So on the one hand, you're no longer technically in breach of a retail contract. Many PBMs say that the standard terms and standard contract is for a retail pharmacy, and they reserve the right to exclude pharmacies that are engaged in the practice of specialty pharmacy because it's not a retail, they're not acting as a retail pharmacy. You often get the benefit of being able to mail prescriptions to your patients with less limitation. As I mentioned, it may yield greater access to limited distribution drugs by being able to show wide network access and coverage. And while not as applicable in the hospital and health system space, but nevertheless still a factor, it increases your bottom line and makes you a greater acquisition target. Some of the downsides is there are administrative burdens of being in these networks. There's heightened and excessive reporting requirements. I've also mentioned there's lower reimbursement rates generally. And the other concept of greater degrees of imposition of DIR fees, because you're now doing a greater percentage of specialty medication that in turn have typically higher amounts of DIR fees, just aggregate net amounts of DIR fees, because they're typically tied to a percentage rather than a flat rate. Another concept I want to talk quickly about is the differences between claims being paid under a medical benefit versus claims being paid under a pharmacy benefit. So under medical benefit, these are processed and reimbursed by the health insurance company under the medical side of the benefit. So if you were to envision Anthem and Express Scripts, they'd be submitted to Anthem, paid out by Anthem, as opposed to a pharmacy benefit, which might be submitted and paid out by Express Scripts. These are typically more open networks. They are less likely to be, the prescriptions are less likely to be routed to a PBM-owned pharmacy, and oftentimes will include reimbursement for ancillary services such as nursing time and supplies. The pharmacy benefit are processed under the pharmacy side and typically have more restricted networks, and there's greater incentive for the PBM to direct business to their wholly owned specialty pharmacies, and they're also less likely to provide for reimbursement for ancillary services and supplies. We are seeing a growing and alarming trend, pushed largely by PBMs, of merging the medical benefit into the pharmacy benefit and requiring even products that are going to be utilized in the procedure or that are going to be infused in an infusion center or by a physician to be processed and dispensed by a pharmacy on the pharmacy benefits side, and then have the patients either white bag or brown bag the medication to the infusion center or to the physician. So an example, the concept of white bagging, brown bagging, white bagging, for example, CVS Specialty Pharmacy might fill the prescription and overnight it directly to the infusion center, who will then take the prescription and administer it to the patient once they come in, or brown bagging, where CVS Specialty Pharmacy will actually dispense the medication and deliver it to the patient, and the patient will then come in with the medication in hand. Both of these scenarios, particularly when there's on-site dispensing capabilities at the facility, create huge issues when it comes to the product integrity and overall safety for the patient, because now you've taken what could have been the trip of a medication coming from the pharmacy located within the same building, brought by employed personnel to the other area of the campus for infusion, and now having a situation where it has to leave the pharmacy altogether, go either into the mail, go to a courier, or worse yet, go to the patient who may not be storing in the ideal situation. And at the end of the day, as the health system, you're conceivably on the hook if something goes awry when you're administering that medication to the patient. So it creates a really big issue, not just an economic one, but also a safety one as well. So now let's talk about some of the tools that are available to pharmacy providers to kind of stem this tide against it. So one of the strongest ones that we've seen is the Any Willing Provider Law. There's a federal Any Willing Provider Law under Medicare Part D that applies all across the country, including District of Columbia. There's also the Federal Freedom of Patient Choice Law, which is written as the Medicare Part D program, which requires that patients be given the free choice of any provider that they want to choose. The Medicare Any Willing Provider Law essentially states that any pharmacy willing and able to meet the terms and conditions under the plan must be allowed to participate. And that plans must have a standard contract with reasonable and relevant terms and conditions of participation, whereby any willing pharmacy may access the standard contract and participate as a network pharmacy. There's also a number of states that have either Any Willing Provider Laws or this concept of anti-mandatory mail order law. Any Willing Provider Laws at the state level are written very, very similarly. Anti-mandatory mail order laws essentially take the position that a PBM can't require you to obtain your medication from a mail order pharmacy and must at the very least give you the option of getting it at a retail pharmacy. It doesn't mean that they have to admit you, but it means that they can't have the only option be from mail order pharmacy. So if you're a provider in, let's say, Iowa, and the only CVS Specialty Pharmacy is located in Des Moines, and you have a patient across the state, a strong argument could be made that they have to allow you to service that patient, because otherwise the only other route for the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy would be to mail it to the patient. So while not quite as strong as any willing provider law, it's nevertheless a tool that can be available. So how do providers push back against some of these arduous PBM credentialing concepts? One of the first things that I can recommend is utilizing experienced assistants, a counselor or a consultant, when you're completing these applications. These applications oftentimes, once you're done with the submission and providing all the required documents, can be in the hundreds of pages. They actually look at them. They look at them and they score them. Sometimes their scoring is a black box, completely amorphous and difficult to understand how they're scoring, but nevertheless, they are looking at these things, and it's important to be mindful of the responses that are being given so that they are accurate and that they can meet the terms and conditions. If you're denied the admission into a specialty network, there are rights under the contract. Typically, there are dispute resolution proceedings that can be occurred even short of having to go to arbitration or litigation. And then finally, a tool that we've used successfully on many instances is engaging in arbitration or litigation to essentially compel them to admit a pharmacy into a particular network. These types of litigations or arbitrations leverage some of these rules like any willing provider and some of these other legal concepts. There's also the concept of what type of legal policy framework is going to work best to fix or challenge this. And I want to say a couple words about any willing provider law and some of the recent challenges to that. So any willing provider law, as I mentioned, it won't apply to that whole subset of claims and patients that fall into ERISA preemption. You know, to the extent that there is that they are self-funded claims, forget it. Any willing provider is not going to apply. There are other legal tools that we've used. They go back to the summary plan description and engaging some of those patient rights that flow from that. But any willing provider isn't going to apply to self-funded plans. And in some instances, depending on how the law is written in a particular state, it's ripe for challenge as being preempted, even if it doesn't apply just to self-funded plans. So, for example, if the employer is paying the premiums, it's very possible, depending on the wording of that state's any willing provider law, it could be preempted by ERISA because it conceivably could apply to health benefit plans that are employee benefits under ERISA. And so one of the things that's important is being aware of the specific language within the any willing provider law to ensure that, one, it's not preempted by ERISA, but two, that it adequately extends to PBM. And this is important because there was a recent decision out of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers the District of Missouri, where Express Scripts is located, where the court essentially held for North Carolina's any willing provider law that's written to apply to a health plan, that Express Scripts was not a health plan. Express Scripts is a PBM, they're not a health plan, and as a result, they found that the any willing provider law was not applicable to Express Scripts. It's horrible law, but in the 8th Circuit, which covers Iowa, it covers Missouri, covers a couple other jurisdictions, that's the federal ruling on at least North Carolina's any willing provider law. So what that means is we strongly recommend that pharmacies and healthcare providers and pharmacy providers do what we call gap analysis, where we look at the laws that are in that state. And we extend it beyond just any willing provider, but we look at the laws in that state and analyze what are the weaknesses. You know, weaknesses could be that it's written as applicable to health plans and it's defined too narrowly and it's not going to subsume PBMs into that mix. You know, we've recently had litigation where PBM representatives have claimed under oath that they are not bound by the any willing provider law. Their health plan customers might be, but they don't view themselves as being bound by any willing provider law. So if we're going to increase the utilization and increase the strength of these tools, it's important to be aware of the language and to advocate for change and advocate for strong rules. Another concept that is missing from many states' any willing provider laws is the concept of a private right of action. Under many states' any willing provider laws, the entity that is charged with enforcing the law is typically the state attorney general or the state department, the commissioner of the Department of Insurance. It doesn't typically allow for a aggrieved pharmacy provider to file an independent action or a suit against a PBM for violating that term. There are a handful of states that allow it, but for pharmacies that don't yet have a contract with a PBM, it can be very difficult and very problematic for them to be able to bring any kind of challenge to the PBM's exclusionary conduct. Shifting gears now, I want to talk a little bit about the 340B program and recent PBM activity within the 340B space. So a really alarming trend that's occurred over the past year and a half or so is more and more PBMs have begun to attempt to retain the spread that results from the cost of the PBM, the 340B, and the PBM reimbursement for the 340B drugs. So this is a situation where you as a covered entity or through a contract pharmacy are acquiring a drug under the 340B program at a discounted price. And under the 340B program, you're entitled to charge up to and including the normal reimbursement rates, normal usual and customary charges for that product, and take that statutory savings and apply it to further the goals of the 340B program, to extend care to disproportionate, to disadvantaged populations and underserved populations, to fund unfunded care that occurs for disproportionate share hospitals and the like. So what some of these PBMs have done is sent notices to pharmacies that require the pharmacies to submit the 340B claim with a submission clarification code that indicates that they are using 340B inventory in order when processing that prescription and to alert the PBM that it's a 340B claim. And in some instances, if the pharmacy or the 340B entity is using a third-party administrator to determine 340B eligibility, sometimes they may even have the third-party administrator provide that information. But ultimately, the intent is to then reimburse the pharmacy a lower amount for the claim that's associated with that code. So essentially, they are usurping, they are stealing the savings and going, for example, you might normally be reimbursed at AWP minus 18%, but as soon as you trip the 340B flag, the 340B indicator, the PBM is going to reimburse you at AWP minus 33%. And essentially take a huge amount, if not all, of the savings that's normally supposed to flow to the covered entity and apply it to either the PBM or optimistically to the plan, but in reality, it's very possible they're pocketing that additional spread between what they charge the plan sponsor and what they pay out to the pharmacy. So other PBMs have begun utilizing their own internal third-party administrators if the party is contracted with the pharmacy or the covered entity to determine which claims are 340B claims. And essentially, they're trying to create databases of these claims and these patients to be able to know, irrespective of whether you flag it at the point of sale, whether it is a 340B claim. But the question is whether the PBM can essentially take the 340B savings. So as I mentioned, HRSA, Health Resources and Services Administration, the agency charged with overseeing the 340B program, has said strongly and many times that the 340B program is designed to enable covered entities to stretch scarce federal resources as far as possible, reaching more eligible patients and providing more comprehensive services. This is the underlying legislative purpose of the 340B program. So by taking that savings and reimbursing the covered entities and their contract pharmacies less, and taking that savings and either pocketing it or passing it on to their plan sponsor clients, the PBM is essentially circumventing the legislative intent of the 340B program to use those excessive profits that should have been there to provide care to underserved populations. If ever presented with these types of contracts, it's important that these issues be raised with them, and frankly with regulators too. And to the extent that they are seeking to amend your contract, it's important to know what rights you have when it comes to how and when and what circumstances your contracts can be amended, particularly mid-year, and particularly for government plans such as Medicare and Medicaid. Now, in a very interesting recent turn of events, CVS Caremark, who had previously been poised to basically do the exact same thing, recently announced a reversal of course, and that they're no longer planning to issue these pay cuts to 340B providers. And they indicated that they had done so, citing pushback from 340B pharmacies and indicating that many folks had reached out and had very, very good conversations. So again, in terms of tools, when these things are presented, don't necessarily just take them. Review them, discuss them with counsel, and formulate a response. Even if it's not running to court and suing to try to stop it, engaging in some level of business discussion is going to be helpful, particularly if many people do it. And in terms of going to regulators and legislators, these are additional things that have spurred change. So Congress has begun to ask questions, not just of PBMs, but also of covered entities and contract pharmacies to better understand the savings and what it's being used for. They've asked questions to covered entities relating to number of uninsured patients and what the money is being used for. They've also asked similar questions to contract pharmacies about the use of the products and what steps are being taken to prevent mixing or diversion of 340B medications. Again, these are not only opportunities for pharmacies and covered entities to educate lawmakers on some of these concerns, including, for example, the PBM theft of 340B savings, but also have to be answered and reviewed carefully to ensure that they're remaining in line with the confines of HRSA and of the 340B program. There are other legal considerations that have to be considered, particularly when it comes to contracting between covered entities and contract pharmacies, ensuring that the contract is compliant with HRSA and doesn't run afoul of other healthcare statutes and regulations, such as state fee splitting or anti-kickback statutes. The final point I'll make on the 340B program relates to Caremark's recent acquisition of WellPartner, who has been a 340B third-party administrator. Essentially, what it's alleged that they're doing, and they're being sued by some of WellPartner's competitors, is that they are utilizing the information that WellPartner processes and using it to go and steal business from WellPartner's competitors. But more concerningly, we also know that when PBMs begin to look to cut the reimbursement, their ownership of this third-party administrator gives them an inside track into knowing which claims are 340B and which claims are not, and be able to usurp the savings right then and there. So now I'm going to transition a little bit into talking about limited distribution drugs and some of the concerns that flow from the strength of the PBMs as it relates to these limited distribution drugs. So I use this slide as a good example to show the alliances within the industry. You can see over time there has become incredible vertical integration and alliances formed within the industry where all the way down from health insurance company to PBM-owned pharmacies, and even in some instances to wholesalers, there is complete integration. And so what this means is that PBMs have a ability to leverage their relationships at the PBM level to garner a benefit for their specialty pharmacies or vice versa. So limited distribution drugs. What are limited distribution drugs? They are typically medications that treat conditions affecting only a small number of patients. They're typically very expensive. They oftentimes will require special handling, such as cold chain management or other types of reporting. The manufacturers will oftentimes require only a small pool of dispensing pharmacies that they'll even give access to. And reason being, some of these might be high-risk medications where the FDA, pursuant to their approval, requires a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, or REMS program, where there has to be active reporting. It's also the concept of ultra-limited distribution drugs, and these are typically LDDs that there's only 5 or fewer pharmacies with access to it. So what do the PBMs do when it comes to limited distribution drugs, and what are some of the ways that folks get access versus through clinical or merit-based superiority versus anti-competitive conduct? So in this example, we have a limited distribution drug. The manufacturer decides to give it to an independent specialty pharmacy based on merit. This is because they decide the pharmacy will yield superior outcomes, there's clinical advantages, the pharmacy has shown skilled education and administration capabilities or ability to integrate with FDA reporting. In terms of acquiring it by force or using anti-competitive conduct, what essentially the PBM is doing is through this vertical integration, is they are saying, manufacturer, unless you give me access to your limited distribution drug, I am going to put all your other drugs off formulary. So patients are going to have to pay through the nose if they want to use your other medications. Alternatively, what they'll say is, all right, fine, if you don't give me access to a limited distribution drug, I'm just not going to pay your network pharmacies enough for them to buy the drug from you. They're not going to want to fill the medication because they're going to lose money on every single claim, so you might as well just give me access. These are ways that PBMs use to get these limited distribution drugs by force. So what does that mean? That means there's direct harm to a number of stakeholders. In terms of economic harm to specialty providers, it's pretty clear. Once the PBM-owned pharmacies have access to limited distribution drugs, PBMs are incentivized to either lower reimbursements to drive out competitors or otherwise exclude other specialty pharmacies and independent pharmacies from the network altogether. PBMs are left unharmed because they're benefiting from that spread pricing, even if they're reimbursing the pharmacies below their acquisition costs, including themselves. There's also harm to drug manufacturers. Lower reimbursements limit their ability to provide other services and other support. And finally, there's obviously economic harm to patients because they'll experience decrease in quality of care, access to a number of specialty pharmacies, and increased risk of higher copays because fewer independent providers willing to work with them on finding care and finding charitable support are no longer available. How could this violate antitrust law? This is one of the areas that we've explored, and there's this concept of exclusivity in dealing, where a PBM is only going to deal with a particular, is only going to allow the manufacturer's products on formulary if they deal with that particular specialty pharmacy. There's also the concept of tying, where they will tie reimbursement to a manufacturer's other product based on their own access to limited distribution drug. There's also concepts of predatory pricing refusals to deal. As I mentioned, tying is unilateral conduct by one company that has market power over some product. There are a couple steps that go into this. You have to understand what is being monopolized, what is being tied. And a good example that we use is pharma company has an 85% market share in prescription antacids, where it's well established, but a low share of prescriptions in ulcer medication, a market which it's just entered. It now requires purchasers who wish to buy its antacids to also buy its ulcer meds. The end effect is the tie-in, meaning the two products are no longer available separately. That's essentially what PBMs have done here when it comes to requiring the manufacturers to give them access to that drug. Either you give us access to the drug, or we're not going to give your other products access on our formulary. I'll talk quickly about this concept of prescription trolling. This is the concept where essentially the PBM swoops in, and after allowing the pharmacy to fill the first claim, it swoops in and requires all future refills to be filled at the PBM specialty pharmacy. The first fill is typically the pharmacy's most expensive claim. It includes the coordination with the prescriber, prior authorization assistance, seeking out patient assistance programs, doing the patient training and skilled nursing administration. This, in a nutshell, is not allowable under CMS or under HIPAA by allowing the PBM, the plan, to get access to information that's being submitted by an independent pharmacy to the PBM for purposes of reimbursement. And the point is that there's tools. In terms of preventing this type of patient steering, pharmacies must demand PBM adherence to the law. They can inform patients of their rights and their ability to file complaints with the PBM or with Office of Civil Rights or with Medicare or with the State Department of Insurance. And in this capacity, complaints either by patients or by the PBMs can many times be very, very effective. We have a couple minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about some reimbursement trends. The first of which is direct and indirect remuneration, also known as DIR. It was first coined by CMS, and it was geared towards capturing the rebates that were passed back to the PBM after the point of sale. So, for example, a drug gets reimbursed at the point of sale for $100. PBM submits the prescription drug event to CMS for $100. CMS pays $100, but months and months later, the manufacturer gives it a rebate back to the manufacturer, back to the PBM, reducing the net cost of the drug. CMS wanted to share in that benefit. Now, what has wound up occurring is the PBMs have essentially hijacked the term DIR to extract fees from providers after the point of sale and after the claim has been adjudicated. In terms of some of the continuing developments of DIR, more and more Part D plans and PBMs have expanded percentage-based DIR fees. CMS, fortunately, has issued a recent proposed rule aimed at moving all pharmacy price concessions to the point of sale. This would reduce significantly the PBM's ability to take back money on the back end. It still remains to be seen how they're going to deal with the payment of money at the point of sale, particularly if you have the ability to earn a bonus, but we'll see how that plays out. Nevertheless, in many instances, DIR poses an existential crisis for many specialty pharmacies because it's resulting in below-water reimbursement. And there have been a lot of pushback in the industry through white papers and through litigations and arbitrations commenced by independent providers. What does the law say? It's simple. It's unreasonable and unrelevant for a PBM to offer unreasonably low reimbursement rates for specialty drugs in an effort to subvert convenience access standards. So in other words, they have to offer reasonable and relevant reimbursement terms that adequately cover your acquisition cost. And if they don't, through a back-end DIR fee, it's actionable under the Any Willing Provider law. So what tools do pharmacies have? There's, number one, the concept of filing an arbitration against PBMs challenging DIR fees. These can be couched on breach of contract. They can be couched on violations of federal Any Willing Provider laws. But the first step is a demand notice and request for dispute resolution. There's also a concept of being able to commence a direct action against CMS or HHS for violations of the Administrative Procedure Act, because essentially the PBMs are agents of the government. And then finally, there's kind of the soft approach, the soft power approach, which is through further white paper, through further white papers, further lobbying and public relations, and just general market education. And so it's important, these concepts, including the concept of litigation and arbitration, because legislation is uncertain, unpredictable. You're not guaranteed results, and it's not going to deal with past damages. Arbitrations are confidential. The DIR fee annual reporting requirement is largely an obligation of the plan sponsor, not the PBM. And so if we're really going to push the issue, we have to attack the PBM, not the plan sponsor per se, because PBM is the ones really behind it. There's also been a lot of information coming from the top through Secretary Azar and the Office of Inspector General relating to DIR fees. The more of these actions we get going, the stronger it's going to be to really changing the paradigm here. The issue is that for a lot of these government investigations, they're without the full set of facts, and the benefit of an arbitration litigation is strong discovery, is being able to get in there and get the information directly from the PBM in the course of the case and be able to really understand what's going on. I'll say a couple quick words on associational standing. This is the concept, it's a judicial legal doctrine allowing an organization to basically sue for an injury on behalf of one or more of its members. There's a couple of requirements that have to go into whether or not an association can demonstrate standing. including that at least one of its members has standing, that the interests are germane to the organization's purpose, and neither the claim nor the relief requires participation of individual members. There's also a concept of an organization suffering their own independent direct stand. This could be because they've been caused injury by virtue of some type of action by another. So in this case, to the extent an organization has had to divert resources or otherwise frustrated their mission to deal with a particular concept, that could create independent standing to bring a challenge in their own right. The final word I'll make on DIR is related to what Congress is currently looking at. They've issued demand letters, inquiry letters, I should say, to a variety of PBMs asking for information about a number of things, including DIR. They've asked about how it's being reported, the pricing, their definition of specialty drugs, list of drug prices, and this concept of the non-interference clause to gauge what the PBM's view of their ability to get involved in being able to prevent CMS or dictate how and under what circumstances CMS can be involved in this pricing dispute. Now we're running up right on the edge of the hour. I have a few more slides on NADAC, which is the new Medicaid pricing trend. Is the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost program, which is a pricing benchmark that's designed to essentially take industry averages and apply them across the board. It's resulted in a little bit of commoditization of the services being provided by specialty pharmacies. Initially, it wasn't intended to apply in the specialty context. However, there have been a number of instances where specialty medications, particularly in the HIV space or in the multiple sclerosis or anti-inflammatory drugs, that are being swept within it, because in reality it's supposed to be retail drugs, not specialty drugs. But nevertheless, there is some impact that we're seeing on specialty pharmacy. The professional fee generally is not capturing the amount of services and the amount of work that has to go into managing some of these specialty medications, especially limited distribution drugs. As I mentioned, it commoditizes specialty pharmacy services and doesn't take into account the high touch and high value services that they provide. So what can be done? The fortunate thing is that there's essentially federal court guidance that's given a very strong roadmap to how to challenge these types of things. At least two ways that you can do to challenge unreasonable reimbursement in violation of these regulations. One, file an Administrative Procedure Act claim arguing that CMS and HHS failed to act by not enforcing the regulations. Or two, petition HHS or CMS to amend or repeal its rules to disallow NADAC pricing for specialty pharmacy. When that petition is denied, then seek judicial review of that denial based on arbitrary, capricious, or abuse of discretion and not being in accordance with law. And so basically three options for pharmacies facing unreasonably low reimbursement under NADAC. The first, as I mentioned, is a litigation approach. The second is a government affairs approach. This goes back to pushing for change, pushing for legislative change at a lawmaking level. And the final is this concept of a formal appeal process through the accounting firm that's been employed, Myers and Stauffer. Pharmacy inquiries are investigated and evaluated based on invoice data collected from the pharmacy that initiates the review. And the more pharmacies that can contact the help desk and basically commence this type of appeal, the more likely a pharmacy might be to get a NADAC reimbursement adjustment when it can be shown that the drug pricing changes have been substantiated and that there's an actual change within the marketplace. So, those are essentially the options that are available in dealing with below market reimbursement through NADAC. I understand I covered a lot, and we're right at the hour, so I'm not sure if we still have decent time for questions. I'm available and can make myself available either through this webinar or otherwise. my email address is not on here, but it's jdresser@frierlevitt.com. So if you don't get a question asked here, please feel free to email me directly. But Steve, if we have time for questions, I'm happy to bang through as many as people have.
Well, there's a couple of questions here that I would like to address. The first is from Cindy, and she asks about a new AARP Part D Medicare plan that has an exclusive provider network with one of the major chains. So Medicare supplement programs, are they considered managed Medicare, and are they allowed to restrict the networks, or does any willing provider apply to those plans as well?
So this concept of supplement plans and the concept of open networks. So Medicare Part D requires that Part D plans, traditional Part D plans and Medicare Advantage plans that have a prescription drug benefit, have a standard network that allows anyone in it. It doesn't prohibit them from creating preferred networks that in turn have a smaller subset of folks that are able to be within that network. Now, the concept of a supplemental plan, that is a plan that goes beyond standard drug coverage and essentially sits in the secondary, that's not as well settled. And so what I would suggest in a situation like that is to really understand that plan, get as much information as you can about that plan, and then what we would do from there is see where it stacks up on the Part D spectrum, whether it's actually a Part D plan that's listed in the plan finder, or whether it's a supplemental plan and has to be subject to there being other coverage. And if it's subject to being other coverage, then you might not have the same tools available, but if it's a Part D plan, there has to at least be a standard network that allows for any willing provider.
All right, Jesse, thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry we have run out of time and we have to stop the recording. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and again, thank you for the presentation. Hope everyone has a great day. Take care now.
Thank you.